Chris Lawson was calculating whether $18 was enough for 2 dinners when he saw the woman sitting at the far end of the park bench. It was Thursday evening, the specific Thursday of the week, the one between paydays when his account had just enough and not quite enough simultaneously. His daughter Emma was 6 years old and tired from a full school day and had been asking about dinner since 4:30. He had been trying to solve the arithmetic of getting through Friday on what was in his wallet without making Emma understand that the arithmetic was difficult. The woman on the bench was elderly, small, dressed in layers that had been washed too many times, with a stillness about her that was not the stillness of rest, but of someone who had been sitting in one place long enough that moving no longer seemed like it would help. Chris stopped Emma on the sidewalk. He looked at the woman. He looked at his wallet. He made a decision that did not take long. He went to the food truck 20 feet away, bought 3 dinners instead of 2, and walked to the bench. The woman looked up at him. He put a container of food in front of her, sat down on the far end of the bench, and let Emma sit between them, and they ate dinner together in the park in the Thursday evening light. The woman's name, she said, was Ruth. He did not ask her last name. He asked if she was warm enough, and she said she would manage. He walked Emma home at 8, did the bedtime routine, and sat alone in his kitchen for a while, thinking about nothing in particular. The next morning, 3 black SUVs were parked in front of his building. He was not given any context to understand what that meant until a woman stepped out of the middle vehicle. She was the woman from the bench. She was wearing a different coat, cashmere, the kind you don't see very often up close. Behind her, the 2 other vehicles had disgorged 4 people in suits who arranged themselves at a respectful distance. And what she told him, standing on the sidewalk outside his building with Emma watching from the window upstairs, was the beginning of the most consequential, complicated, and, eventually, defining chapter of his life. Please like this video right now. I'm genuinely asking. Those likes mean so much for stories like this. Hit the button, subscribe to, completely free, drop a comment, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let me tell you who Ruth actually was. Chris Lawson was 33 and had been raising Emma alone for 4 years, since her mother had left when Emma was 2. Not dramatically, not with cruelty, but with the specific honesty of someone who had realized that the life she was building with Chris was not the life she needed, and who had decided that honesty, even when it cost everyone involved, was better than the alternative. Chris had not disagreed with her reasoning. He had simply remained. For Emma, for the small apartment, for the job he worked as a warehouse shift supervisor that paid enough and not more than enough, for the steady, patient mechanics of a life built around one priority that was not himself. He was not a man who complained about his circumstances. He was a man who managed them with the specific dignity of someone who has decided that the alternative to managing them well is unacceptable. He had not fed Ruth because he expected anything from it. He had fed her because Emma was sitting next to him and he wanted his daughter to grow up understanding that the calculation for whether to help someone was simpler than most people made it seem. He had not known who Ruth was. Nobody in the park had known who Ruth was. That had been the point. Ruth Harrington was 71 years old and had spent 40 years building Harrington Solutions, a logistics and supply chain consulting firm that had grown, under her and her late husband Gerald's leadership, into one of the most significant operations of its kind in the country. Gerald had died 4 years ago, 6 weeks after the diagnosis. The grief had been real and complete, and had not diminished in the way people suggested it would. It had changed in character, moved from acute to structural, becoming something Ruth carried rather than something that carried her. But it had not left. What had left, in the 18 months following Gerald's death, was Ruth's certainty about the people around her. Her 2 children, a son named Robert and a daughter named Melissa, had arrived at Gerald's funeral with an attentiveness that Ruth had initially attributed to grief and had, over the following months, come to understand was something else. They were attentive to the estate documentation. They were attentive to the foundation's board structure. They were attentive to everything connected to what would eventually become theirs, and significantly less attentive to Ruth herself. She had established, with Gerald, a family foundation that directed significant charitable resources toward food security and housing initiatives. The foundation was the thing she cared most about, beyond Gerald's memory, and it was the thing her children were most interested in controlling, for reasons that had nothing to do with food security or housing. Ruth had made a decision 2 years after Gerald's death that she needed to understand something she had lost the ability to see clearly inside the insulated, transactional world of her wealth. She had needed to find out what it looked like when people were simply decent, when nothing was being offered, nothing could be taken, and still someone stopped and bought dinner. She had been conducting her own experiment for 6 weeks in various parks and benches across the city, and had spent most of those weeks watching people perform careful indifference. On a Thursday evening, a single father with a 6-year-old daughter and $18 had sat down beside her and asked if she was warm enough. She had made a decision that night. On the sidewalk outside Chris's building, Ruth told him she wanted to show him something. She led him, with Emma holding Chris's hand and the suited attendants at a respectful distance, through a brief explanation of who she was and what she was considering. She told him about the foundation, about Gerald, about the 18 months of watching her children manage her grief from the direction of the estate attorney's office. She told him she had been looking for something she couldn't buy, a person whose first instinct, without any prospect of reward, was simply to help. She said she had found it on a park bench on a Thursday. Chris said he had just bought dinner. She said, exactly. What she was proposing was not impulsive. She had spent the night consulting with her personal attorney, who had been with her for 20 years, and who trusted her judgment in all things except, periodically, her tendency to act before explaining herself to anyone. She was offering Chris a role as trustee and co-director of the Harrington Family Foundation, a role that came with both responsibility and compensation, that would take him out of the warehouse shift and into something that would require his full attention and a steep learning curve, and that came with no guarantee that he would succeed beyond her belief, formed in 4 hours on a park bench, that he was worth betting on. He asked her why she didn't give it to one of her existing staff, people who already knew the foundation's work. She said she had plenty of people who knew the work. She needed someone who understood what the work was actually for. He took Emma upstairs. He sat in his kitchen for a long time. He thought about what $18 had produced. He called the number on the card she had left. He said yes. Robert and Melissa Harrington found out about the appointment 3 days later from their mother's attorney's office in the specific procedural way that significant decisions about family estates communicate themselves to interested parties. The response was immediate and, to anyone who had been watching the previous 18 months, entirely predictable. Robert was 42 and had spent most of his adult life operating in the comfortable orbit of his parents' success. He was not unintelligent, but he had never particularly tested his intelligence against anything that required real effort, and he had developed, over years, a particular resentment of situations where outcomes were not already arranged in his favor. Melissa was 39 and was, in many respects, more strategic than her brother, which made her, in this situation, more dangerous. She had, within 48 hours of learning about Chris's appointment, retained an attorney and initiated a legal review of the foundation's governance documents, looking for any mechanism by which the appointment could be challenged. She found 3 potentially exploitable procedural questions. She also hired a private investigator to build a complete profile of Chris Lawson. She was looking for anything that could be used. Please like this video, I'm asking you. Those likes mean so much for stories like this. Hit the button. Subscribe if you haven't. Free. Drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? Now the part where they come after him. The private investigator's report, delivered to Melissa 2 weeks after Chris's appointment, was unremarkable in almost every respect. No criminal record, no financial fraud, no significant debt beyond the ordinary, no personal scandals, no hidden history, no exploitable complications in his background. The report described, in the dry language of professional investigation, a man who had been managing a hard life with straightforward integrity. Melissa found this frustrating. She and Robert pivoted to a different approach. The legal review had identified a clause in the Foundation's original governance documents that gave family members the right to formally contest a trustee appointment on the basis of professional qualifications and relevant experience, a clause that had been written, presumably, to protect the Foundation from incompetent appointments, and which had never needed to be invoked because the Foundation had never had a trustee that wasn't a family member. Robert and Melissa filed the contest jointly, arguing that Chris Lawson had no relevant professional experience in philanthropy, foundation management, or charitable operations, and that his appointment represented a breach of the Foundation's fiduciary responsibility to its beneficiaries. It was a legal argument, and it was not entirely without merit, which was what made it genuinely dangerous. Ruth was informed of the filing on a Monday morning. She called Chris directly. She told him what was happening. She told him she intended to fight it. She asked if he was willing to fight it too. Chris said yes. He said something else, that if the legal argument was actually correct, if he genuinely lacked what the Foundation needed, then perhaps the contest wasn't wrong. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You just proved why I made the appointment." Ruth's personal attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Patricia Vance, who had managed the Harrington legal affairs through 30 years of increasingly complex situations, filed the formal response to the contest. The response argued with considerable documentation that the Foundation's governance clause had been written with professional incompetence in mind, not character, and that the Foundation's mission, ensuring that resources reached people who actually needed them, managed by people who actually understood need rather than merely studied it, was better served by Chris Lawson's background than by either of Ruth's children. Patricia also filed as a supplementary document a detailed review of Robert's and Melissa's own involvement with the Foundation over the previous 4 years, specifically, their documented absence from board meetings, their consistent failure to engage with program outcomes, and 3 specific instances in which decisions made by their advisors had redirected Foundation resources in ways that benefited connected businesses rather than stated charitable goals. The supplementary document was, in the legal context of the contest they had initiated, directly relevant. It was also the most uncomfortable set of documents either of them had ever seen put formally on record. The Foundation governance hearing was not a public trial. It was a civil procedure before a judge reviewing the contest, but Ruth attended. She was 71 years old and had built a billion-dollar company and had buried her husband and had spent 2 years watching her children manage her grief from the direction of the estate documentation, and she stood up in that hearing room and spoke clearly and without hesitation about why she had made the appointment and what she had seen in the park and what she believed the Foundation required that her children had consistently failed to provide. The judge reviewed the full documentation, the governance clause, Patricia's response, the supplementary record of Robert's and Melissa's Foundation engagement, and Chris's own testimony, which he had prepared carefully and which covered his understanding of the Foundation's mission, the learning he had undertaken in the weeks since his appointment, and the specific work he intended to do. The judge denied the contest. She noted in her ruling that the governance clause's intent was manifestly the protection of the Foundation's mission rather than the creation of a hereditary claim on its leadership, and that the documented evidence regarding the contesting parties' engagement with that mission did not support their argument that they were better positioned to fulfill it. Robert and Melissa, sitting side by side in the hearing room, said nothing. Ruth looked at Chris across the room. He looked back. Neither of them performed anything. They simply understood that the thing Ruth had believed on a park bench had just been confirmed in a room full of lawyers, and that what came next was actually doing the work. The Foundation work was, as Ruth had warned, a steep learning curve. Chris spent the first 6 months learning more about charitable operations, grant management, program evaluation, and organizational governance than he had learned in the previous decade. Assisted by a staff Ruth had assembled, and a willingness to ask questions that did not pretend to expertise he didn't yet have. He was good at the work, not because it came naturally, but because he approached it the same way he had approached everything in his adult life, with the steady, patient thoroughness of someone who does not have the luxury of being wrong about something that matters. The foundation grew under his direction in the years that followed, not explosively but correctly, with the specific, careful expansion of an organization that understood what it was for and made decisions in alignment with that understanding, rather than in alignment with what looked impressive. Ruth remained involved in an advisory capacity for 3 more years, attending board meetings, reviewing program outcomes, asking the questions that kept the organization honest. She also had dinner at Chris and Emma's apartment every 2 weeks, which had not been planned and had simply become something that happened and then continued happening. Emma called her Ruth, not Mrs. Harrington, and showed her drawings from school and explained the plots of movies with the specific, comprehensive attention to detail of a 9-year-old who takes storytelling seriously. Ruth sat through these explanations with the specific patient attention of a person who has been looking for family in a world that had given her mostly transactions and had finally, unexpectedly, found some. Chris launched his own consulting practice in year 4, small initially, built on relationships formed through the foundation work, focused on helping smaller nonprofit organizations develop sustainable operational structures. It grew steadily, and then significantly, and by year 6, had become a genuinely respected firm in its space. He was not a billionaire. He was, by the time Emma was 12, successful in the specific way that matters most, doing work that used what he was actually good at, with people he actually respected, supported by financial stability he had built rather than inherited. Emma grew up knowing the story of the park bench and the $18. She grew up understanding, without it ever being stated as a lesson, that the calculation for whether to help someone was simpler than most people made it seem. Ruth died at 77, quietly, in her own house, with the people she had chosen around her. She left the foundation to be governed by the board structure Chris had built, with provisions ensuring it would operate independently for decades. She left Chris a personal letter. The letter said, among other things, that on the night he had sat down beside her on the bench, she had not been trying to find anyone. She had simply gone looking for evidence that people were still decent, because she needed to believe that. She said she had found it. She said she had not expected the evidence to be so stubbornly, persistently, specifically decent in every subsequent situation she had been able to observe. She said she hoped Emma knew what her father was. She said, "Tell her. The actual words. She deserves to hear them from you." Chris Lawson spent $18 on a Thursday evening and asked an elderly stranger if she was warm enough. He did not do it to change his life. He did it because Emma was watching, and he wanted her to understand something about how people should treat each other. She understood. She has understood growing up, not because her father gave her a lesson, but because her father simply kept doing the same thing. Stopping when stopping was right, helping when helping was possible, not performing any of it, because that was never the point. Here is what I want to leave you with. Ruth chose Chris over her own children. She saw, in one evening on a park bench, something she hadn't seen in years of watching her family. Some people will say blood is still blood, that no matter what her children did, bypassing them was a wound that couldn't be undone. Others will say that family is who you find, not just who you're born to, and that Ruth had simply found hers. What do you think? Was Ruth right to make that choice? And do you believe, honestly, that one act of genuine kindness can be enough to show someone's whole character? Drop your answer in the comments. I want the real one, and please tell me where you're watching from. Please like this video, genuinely. Those likes are what keeps stories like this reaching people. Hit the button. Subscribe if you haven't. It's free. Share this with someone today. See you in the next one.